Hello, everyone, and welcome to this webinar. We're going to kick off in just a few moments. Just to give you a little bit of housekeeping, we have this webinar will be recorded and will be made available afterwards. You can ask questions, so feel free to use the panel in front of you to ask your Q&A, and that will arrive to us in the background, so we can make sure we deal with that. In today's webinar, it should be around 40 to 45 minutes. We're going to be talking about how you measure security. Measuring security is one of those things that I think everyone tries, but not everyone always is happy with the way they do it, and it's an ever-changing world, as we'll talk about in just a few moments. But we're going to bring some ideas about how our guests today, Alyssa and Nick, are doing their measuring programs in their companies, and some thoughts about things that they want to do going forward. So welcome to this webinar. Why don't I introduce our guests? We have Alyssa Miller, BISO at S&P Global, and we also have Nick Vinson, DevSecOps lead at Pearson. So why don't I ask Alyssa, tell us, Alyssa, what is a BISO role?
You have no idea how many times I get that question. So BISO is Business Information Security Officer. Basically, I direct the security strategy for our global ratings division. So if you think about, a lot of organizations traditionally have, say, a divisional CISO, who's usually a CISO within a division that reports to the centralized CISO. A BISO in this case, I don't report to the security function at all. I actually report to the CTO within our division. And the goal of that role really is that I bridge the gap between our business line and our devs and our engineering teams and the product teams, everybody that's focused on the business, and our centralized security team, so that I can bring context both ways. So bringing security practices down into the business in a way that's meaningful for the business, but then also bringing that business context back to the security team so they can better understand how they can structure the processes and tooling and things that they're asking us to use to better fit what it is we're doing from a business.
Awesome. And just to throw a curveball question in there, Alyssa, you know how I like curveball questions. What would you say is one of your favorite Netflix shows more recently?
Ooh, I've been watching, I don't know if it's technically Netflix because I think it's through like another network, but it's on Netflix. It's called Reign. So it's
Rain.
loosely the story of Mary, Queen of Scots. Yeah, I actually just finished binging through that one.
Awesome, awesome. Not relevant to the webinar, Alyssa, but I really need some recommendations. I'm getting close to the end, but I need some good recommendations. Thank you. And Nick, DevSecOps lead at Pearson. Tell us a little bit about what you do there and what Pearson do as a company.
Yeah, so for everyone that doesn't know, Pearson is a global learning company. Traditionally, we've been involved with providing education products to institutions, universities, schools, but now we're looking as a kind of broader strategy to become a lifelong learner partner for individuals as well. In terms of my role there, I'm a DevSecOps lead. I lead a security engineering team within what's called our product security office, and my goal really, and my team's goal, is to improve the security of our products that we develop, and we do that by trying to train up the application development teams to be self-sufficient for their own security. So we help do research and development, define what security best practices look like, try and define processes around that, and then via our security champions program, try and sort of organically train up the teams to become self-sufficient.
Amazing. And Nick, your curveball question will be, if you could be any Marvel character, who would you be and why?
Deadpool, because he has two swords.
Excellent, excellent. That's good. And Deadpool is a badass superhero as well, so that's cool. Awesome. And my name's Simon Maple. I'm your moderator for today, and I'm the field CTO at Snyk. And what does that mean? Well, that means I guess I have a lot of discussions with lots of different people in and around the security organizations, talking to them about their security programs, sharing knowledge, and encouraging people to have a look at Snyk as well. So I'm very much a pleasure to be here with both Alyssa and Nick. So this is our agenda for today. We're going to look a little bit around in theory, how one might look at measuring a security program in a modern application development environment. This is actually based on a white paper that Alyssa actually wrote when she, how long ago was that, Alyssa? Maybe like 4 or 5 months ago?
Something like
Perhaps
that,
a little bit longer. Yeah, this was in Alyssa's past when she was at Snyk for just over a year. So really pleased to have Alyssa here in person to talk us through that as well. Then we're going to talk about S&P Global's as well as Pearson's approach to measuring security and learn some real world examples there. Q&A, I'd love to take Q&A throughout, so feel free to ask questions as we go, and I'll happily pose those questions as we go, but there will be time at the end of that as well. So let's kick off with how applications have changed, because this is what has really driven a lot of the big questions around measuring our security postures today. When we think about how applications have changed, the pre-cloud developers tended to be mostly focused on the application code that they write, as well as the libraries that they pull in as part of that. And it was largely left to the platform team to look at everything, the stack pretty much that application was based on. This was very much in the time when we used to throw code over the wall and kind of like run away screaming. But these days, when we deploy into the cloud, the developers touch a larger amount of that app, which includes things like our containers, things like our IAC, our Kubernetes config, Terraform scripts, and the app is a lot larger from what the developer looks at. But so the application has changed as a result of that, going from a pre-cloud into more of a cloud-native container, serverless, cloud deployment-based style. Of course, there are a whole different number of threats that a developer now needs to think about, which largely always existed previously to some extent. But these days, it's the developer that touches a lot of those artifacts and needs to be much more aware of those different threats. But one of the other things which has really brought a big challenge is the way we deliver code. And in the past, we looked at that being maybe, well, 20 years ago when I was at IBM, we used to have like 2-year, 3-year delivery cycles of products. And what we're looking at, I mean, what they do now with their application services, they deliver that, weekly, nightly, monthly in different types of builds. And this very fast ability to be able to push code out into a production environment means that we no longer have these point in time moments at which we can say, what is the security posture? How do we measure for this one major release at the time of release? Because we're releasing all the time, we're releasing every day, different components at different times. Now, I'd love to bring in Alyssa at this point already and just say, Alyssa, what does this mean in terms of why does this change the way we measure, going from this kind of like, more traditional measuring periodically to this real-time measuring? What effect does this have for us?
So, I mean, I think your previous slide kind of spoke to it to some degree, and this slide does too, where we see these conflicting motions of, devs are pushing further and further right if we think about things. Even I know it's not very DevOpsy to think of things linearly anymore, but if you think of it in terms of the pipeline as kind of that linear thing, devs their influence, as your previous slide showed, it's more and more deep into the actual deployment environment. Ops in turn, they're pushing up the stack. I mean, think about what your SREs are doing today. They're writing, code a lot of times. You've got infrastructure as code. They might be, they're doing stuff in Terraform and YAML and everything else. And you've got security. We're standing here like we've always been, screaming about trying to push left and get earlier into the life cycle. And the faster that these pipelines move, the more we need to push left with our security initiatives, so we're not holding up that pipeline. So the challenge here is, where we used to be very structured, very rigid, or we tried to be anyway, and very point in time, these environments are too dynamic now. I can't sit here and say, I'm gonna run a dynamic application security test every 90 days and expect that that's gonna tell me meaningful information. It will for that moment, and then 5 minutes later, 25 of those containers are deconstructed and they no longer exist. Or I have an EC2 instance that disappears and the only thing left is the AMI. So if I'm not aware of it, I don't know what's there. And because of that development influence into that space, we need to be more aware of how various characteristics of the pipeline itself can actually impact some of the security posture. So it's not just more dynamic and essentially a need for more real time, but it's understanding metrics in a little bit different way, because just looking at number of vulnerabilities, you know, if I've got one container image with 5 vulnerabilities on it, but that container image spins up 25 instances, well, now I've got 125 vulnerabilities in my production environment. So that doesn't tell me a lot, though, when I look at that, because, well, okay, 125 is actually only 5. It's just there's 25 instances of it. I fix these 5 vulnerabilities in one container image, and I'm golden. So that's where trying to visualize and get meaningful stats that really help us make decisions is so much more complex in this cloud native world that we're living in now.
So the meaningful stats and what you're kind of saying there is the context that is behind a single number. It's not just a single number. You need to understand what else is driving that number, and that kind of like leads us on nicely to this these relationships between stats, between numbers that we're gathering from our production environments or our code, and this is where we see a number changing because of a driving force, and we're measuring both numbers to understand the relationship between them, and to understand that as one changes, the other one will change. So for example, as the number of commits that we push into our code repository changes, it is almost certainly that the number of vulnerabilities that we detect is going to increase as well, unless of course these are remediating changes. But yeah, naturally we would expect that. So the number of vulnerabilities detected going up may actually just be a sign of us pushing a huge amount of code, rather than the fact that the code isn't changing, but we're identifying lots of different vulnerabilities. So Alyssa, talk us through what this kind of like loop is, what a feedback loop here would be.
Yeah, so it's what you'll see called a causal feedback loop, or there's a few different names for it. But yeah, it's really about understanding exactly that relationship that you just described. So if I'm looking at traditional AppSec metrics, I might be looking at the number of vulnerabilities we found with a SAST tool. And yeah, as I see that number start to skyrocket, you know, I start to think, well, wow, my developers are getting a lot worse at writing code. I need to start working more on developer education and writing secure code standards and everything else, until I bring in the context that, yeah, our commit cycles have really accelerated and we're doing far more commits in any given week than we were before. Now suddenly that makes a world of difference, because now it's not necessarily my devs are any better or worse. It's just simply I pushed more code, and like you said, unless you've got a large number of bug fixes or vulnerability fixes in those commits, generally within most organizations you would expect this to be a pretty direct relationship, whereas commits go up, vulnerabilities go up. And so this is where we start to see that it's not the numbers that are so important. It's understanding the story between the relationships of those numbers. And so when we start thinking about how we want to measure and score and or report on in some way our security posture, it's less about those individual numbers and more about looking at these relationships and what's happening inside these relationships.
And I think this is important as well, just in terms of being able to protect your teams and protect those that are behind the scenes, because depending on who is looking at these numbers, if they look at a number out of context and see this number has doubled since last week, well, that could just be because my production environment is doubled in size. We're no more or less vulnerable than we were previously, but depending on who looks at that, it very much determines what take people have. Nick, in your experience, in when we look at who is looking at different types of metrics, who are we actually creating metrics for? Is it ourselves? Is it developers so that they can kind of, you know, work out what they need to fix? Is it management so that it can get a status on their overall organization? Or is it everyone? Who would you say is most important? Or
yeah, I think the answer is all, but all different groups. But I think the way, the context and how the metrics are being used will obviously be different. So I think again, this will have some, the degree of you know, DevOps transformation and your organization's maturity of implementing DevOps principles can have some impact here. But you know, assuming that you have a shared responsibility model for security and a degree of cross-functional teams. You know, first use of metrics would be validated, used in the integrated the scanning tools integrated into the pipelines, validating that your security practices are effective, and you want the context of those results to be useful for the developers. So you want good accuracy of findings from your scanning tools, and good context saying what needs to be fixed, and any links to useful information about how to do that. So that would be one use of the metrics within the development teams. Another use would be, okay, we need to quantify risk and compliance. Yeah, so we want to quantify risk, and that can help, and that can be for product owners, for business owners. Ultimately, the person who's accountable for any security impact on that product. So that's really about quantifying the risk in those products. And then you potentially got your compliance, and that they can have some crossover there with the quantifying the risk and compliance. But maybe you've got a compliance department, and they want to have a view of a consistent view of risk across all products. So they're probably the three main use cases for reporting metrics.
Mm-hmm. That's similar from your point of view, Alyssa?
Yeah, I mean, let's remember at the end of the day, metrics are about decision making. I mean, everything that we're doing, the reason we measure anything, whether it's our pipeline, whether it's our programs, whatever, it's all about decision making, knowing whether our programs are successful or understanding where the gaps are so that we can make the right decision. So that falls to the individual teams sometimes, all the way clear up to your executive levels of management who might be looking at their reports, and they've got to make decisions on where investments are going to go or how they want to shape the future of a particular business unit. So yeah, this is why it's so crucial that when we think about measuring application security, that we make sure that these metrics that we're pulling are truly contextual and provide us with something meaningful that our executives, our managers, and even our teams who are responsible can all make better decisions and drive better business value from what they do.
And have either of you seen an amount of education that you need to do to your management orgs or development teams for them to appreciate and understand what you're trying to show them, or are they kind of like still asking for something more traditional, high-level numbers?
Yeah, I mean, I think
Go ahead, Nick.
I think a problem we've got is, especially we've seen at the executive level, where you're quite far away from the technical side of things. There is a kind of desire for a single number, or kind of green, amber, red, which often it's difficult to condense enough context into just that. But I think what we've seen has been, at a more technical level, has been a particular challenge, because often we found that, well, previously the metrics for a high performing team could look very similar to a low performing team, because in the high performing team's case, because they're doing good security engineering practices, the developers are using things like the secure defaults in their frameworks, and just maturity of their secure coding principles means they're not introducing vulnerabilities in the first place. And if they are, they're catching them very on in their development life cycle, so they're not going through to later test or production environments. So the detection rate would be low there. Whereas a low performing team, they may have issues of actual scanning coverage, they may be misconfigured, so they're not highlighting things. And it was actually a problem we had a little while back, where actually some of the higher performing teams were being viewed more negatively from a risk perspective because they were doing a better job at identifying vulnerabilities compared to lower performing teams.
Yeah, and I think that's what makes this context so much more important. And as we kind of go deeper, Alyssa, this is kind of like the graph is growing further and further with these different types of relationships. So some of these direct relationships and inverse relationships you'd expect to see an increase or a decrease based on as one thing changes, what the effect is. How in your view, how should a graph like this be put together? Should it be our expectation? Should it or should it be based on our observations, and we just try and tune that to make it better, even better than it is? Or how would we put this kind of graph together with these links?
So the first thing is just starting with the nodes that you're going to add. So if you look at these circles, it's just what metrics do we have available today? And then as we want to start looking at those metrics, it's really important to understand what the current state is. So if I'm already collecting these metrics, I can look at them and I can say, yeah, I see the more vulnerabilities I'm identifying. In this case, as you see here, well, if I identify more and more vulnerabilities, not surprisingly, more of them tend to be lower severity vulnerabilities. So the percent of high severity vulnerabilities versus low, those move in different directions. So if I find a lot of vulnerabilities, I can expect a large portion of them are going to be low severity. Now that can change, right? That can be very different for any organization. This is why it's important to start with metrics you already have, because you can do some of this analysis and you can start to model it out, how it progresses and how it trends within your organization. And that's what's really important here. The key with all of this is understanding organizational context. And so, and then this flows on. So I'm looking at average time to remediate, as we see here at the bottom. And well, the more low severity vulnerabilities I have, the longer it takes, probably because we have standards that say, you have to remediate lows in some really long time period, but your high severity vulnerabilities have a much shorter time frame. So if people are sticking to your policy, the more high severity vulnerabilities you have by percentage, the faster your time to remediate is going to look on average. And so these are, again, things where you have to, that relationship becomes so important, because I can look at my average time to remediate and see that it's doing really, really well. Like we're remediating in, say, 35 days on average. And then I go and I look at it and I say, oh yeah, but that's because there were a bunch of highs. It took me that long to remediate 35 days to remediate highs isn't as good of a story anymore. And so that's where, again, we want to be focused on these relationships, but we build them based on what we see within our own environment. And then from there, as we start to bring in new nodes, now we can be a little more speculative, and we can start to say, hey, as I'm drawing in these other things that maybe I'm going to start measuring, here's what I'm going to expect. I expect that this is going to happen, or maybe I have some indicators, and I leverage those. But the end result is it's all about continuous improvement, right? And people have heard me say this, probably sick of me saying it, but it's the other CI. We've got CI/CD. We need CI in terms of continuous improvement, where I don't expect that I'm going to build this model once and it's just going to work. We're going to constantly be doing it, and these relationships are going to change. And so as I build this all together and I start to have this, to Nick's point, as you move up in upper levels of management, they want to abstract a lot of this. Give me simple numbers, simple indicators, something that says, how are we doing? And then if I want to dig into it, we can dig into it. So building some type of scoring model that's leveraging what's going on in each of these relationships, now you can start to tie that together and develop an application risk score, right? And so as I look at individual risks, I can say, for this application, this is where they're at. For this application, this is where they're at. But then I can, of course, correlate those numbers and bring that all together. And now I can elevate that to an overall application security risk score as well.
And I think that's really, it's an interesting thing where it kind of like leads into that one score. So like you say, depending on who you are, you might not even care about the risks, or you just care about getting these relationships, getting the numbers of the relationships, that ratio of when something changes, something else happens, fixing those relationships, whereas others will not care about any of that. They just care about the application risk score. So once you've created a model like this, like you say, it's not reasonable to try and just lift that and expect that to work in, let's say, Pearson's organization. Or even, would you say, how much would you say this kind of thing is reasonable to share even within one company in different parts of the org? Do you feel like it's something that can easily translate across?
So really depends on the org. If you've got very consistent processes and you're all kind of marching to the same tune, everybody's doing the same form of development, sure. But I don't know many organizations that operate that way. Now, within S&P, for instance, like I mentioned before, I'm in the ratings division, which is, for those of you out there, know Standard and Poor's formerly, we're that credit rating division. So we have a very cloud-centric environment, and we're very DevOps shop. We're moving there more and more. We're in that transformation. And so a lot of the processes that we're following, across my division, I could apply the same model to all of my Scrum teams and to all of the projects and products that we're pushing out the door. But if I move over to one of the other divisions within my organization, they have a very different business model, and how they're deploying is very different. We have some who are very reliant still on on-prem solutions, where, again, us being in cloud, we've already moved beyond EC2, and we're really just containers and functions as a service as our strategy going forward. So yeah, it depends on how structured you are, to what level you can apply that same model. Of course, at the same time, you do want to keep it general enough where ultimately that risk score makes sense across divisions, because there again, that's where you're going to have your executives who are going to be saying, well, I want to compare Division 1 to Division 2, which is honestly not the greatest thing. I really wish that didn't happen at those levels, but it does. And so being prepared to not only answer that question, but then tell the story behind it, where one score for one division is meaningful in the context of another, is going to be important.
And in fact, I'm gonna switch off from slides at this point. There we go. And let's jump this directly into discussion, because I think that leads on to a really interesting point here about when different parts of the division are significantly different. How do you almost like compare? How do you do that same measurement? I'd love to switch across over to Nick and ask. So I know at Pearson you have different parts of the organization at different levels of security adoption, different levels of adoption into other practices, DevOps and things like that. How do you measure across an organization whereby different teams are at different stages in their software development programs?
Yeah, so it's an interesting challenge, especially when lots of large companies sort of had a similar track where you've grown through acquisition, and like you're saying, there's lots of different maturity across the teams in terms of their software development. There's some products where there isn't active development teams. Other products might be working in a kind of more traditional waterfall model, and then you could have some teams which are working in a very mature DevSecOps fashion. So what we kind of took an approach that we wanted a means to kind of consistently quantify security in some form by some metrics across all of those teams. So we developed a security scorecard which every team will fill out. It's quite comprehensive. It covers, I think there's 59 fields across 8 areas. So things like infrastructure security, application security, data management, cryptography, access control, third-party management, that sort of thing. So that will be filled out by all teams, irrelevant of their development maturity. But we also wanted to have an approach which we weren't going to hamstring any of the DevOps teams and more mature teams. So we wanted to have some metrics where we could capture increased granularity and just better quality to reflect what they're doing. So we've developed a security maturity assessment for those teams. It was sort of loosely based on OpenSAM originally, but we thought that was too prescriptive and a bit overwhelming for teams. So we kind of condensed it down to 13 questions across 3 different areas, which correlate to NIST cybersecurity framework. So the first section will be how teams identify security and their responsibility towards it. The second section will be about protecting and detecting, so things like how they've implemented scanning into their pipelines, and security training, and maturity and coding practices, that sort of thing. And then the third section correlates to respond and recover, so protective monitoring and incident response. So all of our teams which are doing DevSecOps will fill this in, and that provides a data point for us to quantify their security maturity, and we can measure that as our security team goes through that engagement process with these teams to measure the improvement. This maturity assessment also provides some useful context. It can identify some areas of concern. For example, if a team's low on the maturity score, and also their vuln stats from the security scorecard are quite low as well, that can tell us that maybe they haven't got a good quality of coverage there, and we can dig into that. The other metrics we're using are basically the output from our threat modeling. So all the teams doing all the DevOps teams doing modern software development will liaise with them and identify security requirements through threat modeling. The output of that is effectively a set of prioritized risks and countermeasures, and so we'll just report on their progress implementing those controls, and that will come up with its own compound risk score. So we're kind of using those things, these 2 different types of threat modeling output and the maturity questionnaire for the more mature teams as well.
And that equally has some, like you say, you had some operational data in there as well, like vulnerability count and things like that you can use with the context of the maturity, the scorecards, the threat modeling.
The way that the vulnerability stats are being recorded in the same way via the scorecard, but what the difference is that effectively threat modeling will be identifying all of the relevant security testing or security functions that the team should be doing and have implemented. And then really with the more mature teams, we're not, as Alyssa was saying earlier, it's that point in time information isn't as valuable when they're releasing multiple times a day. We're more using the security testing in the pipelines as a validation and a note and an alert to say, look, we're introducing a high risk issue here. We want to stop the pipeline and someone needs to investigate it because that shouldn't be happening normally. So we're more using it for a validation that their security practices are effective in the more secure teams.
And Alyssa, at S&P Global, more of the teams are at a similar level in terms of their adoption of development practices and processes, and I would say, more generally comparable. In terms of what challenges you've had going from with all applications being migrated across to more of this kind of like cloud security, cloud deployments, what are your greatest challenges now, and what are you more focused on measuring with all of these deployments?
So I know it's almost ironic, but thinking where we've come from in our cloud transformation just in the last couple of years, again, we're a 100 and some odd year old company and in financial services. So things are there's a lot of old school mentality and a lot of old school processes that we're trying to break out of. And so, I think a lot of it still comes down. There's a lot of things we struggle there. And quite honestly, like I said, things vary across. When I moved to other divisions within the organization, some of them are still much more traditional. I mentioned, a little more reliance on on-prem infrastructure and things of that nature. So, as we kind of within the ratings division are pressing ahead, like you said, we've been able to identify very specific certification criteria that each of our app teams, each of our Scrum teams needs to get to in terms of their maturity, and we're progressing that over time. But so the challenges become, how do we get things to keep up with that level of change? So I've got a lot of tooling to measure cloud security. I've got real-time configuration monitoring. I've got container security. Certainly we've got all the app security tools you would think, but now I've got a lot of this data, and how do I tie this together with a lot of processes and even defined in our standards that are very still point in time based. And so where we struggle the most is just getting good, solid understanding of the metrics that are out there and what they truly mean. And so that's, admittedly, this is the area that I'm really starting to build into with this model, hopefully leveraging my current organization as a great use case for it, because we've got to we're too much in that space right now of just reporting big numbers. And then when these big numbers go up to a certain level of management, the questions come, well, what does this mean? Is this, is this risk? Is this compliance? What do these numbers actually mean to me? And that's where we're struggling to really start to push that needle to where we have a better story behind the numbers, rather than just reporting a bunch of numbers and trying to align them, in our case, to a risk appetite statement that says, hey, this is our tolerance for vulnerabilities in our applications. That doesn't carry weight. I'd much rather be able to tell the story of, hey, we're getting better. This is where we were 3 months ago. This is where we're at now. Because like I said, I don't like the fact that executives a lot of time want to focus on numbers, and they want to compare, how is one division doing versus the other, or how is a particular product team doing versus another. What I want to know is which ones are improving and which ones are not, because the ones that aren't showing improvement, those are ones I want to spend more time and attention on. The ones that are continuing to improve, I want to watch them and be aware of what it is that they're doing, and see if I can bring their lessons to those other teams that maybe aren't doing as well. And that's where that continuous improvement thing comes back, because that's what we should be looking for, is that how do we improve the trends?
So we're not necessarily measuring to say what good looks like. We're measuring to understand how and where we can improve, and then getting to that step. And when we get there, we're not going to say, right, we're finally there, we're good. We work out what's next to improve and continue in that cycle, rather than find a good place and stop there.
Of course. I mean, how many of your security people in your organization are going to be there to stand up and say, yeah, we're fully secure now? No one. I mean, you're constantly working to get more and more secure, because threat landscape, of course, is always changing. So yeah, there's never, I mean, and that's the thing I think we're slowly accepting in cybersecurity world, is there's no end state to this. There's no, we're all secure, we don't have to worry anymore. And instead, it's about resiliency, and it's about continuously getting better. And I mean, quite bluntly, being a little more secure than the competitor down the street. Let them be the one that gets breached. I hate to say that, but that's honestly, what a lot of organizations are working toward. How do we just make sure we're a harder target than someone else, so they'll focus on someone other than us?
Yeah. I'd love to, one thing that you mentioned there, Alyssa, was that kind of like really interested me, is about how we kind of like measure good behavior, measure when we've done something well. And you kind of like mentioned, a number of vulnerabilities going down, or something along those lines, or risk going down. Nick, I'd love to see how this works with you, because you're with the way you do scorecards and things like that. This could be kind of interesting. I'd love to understand and ask a question, and maybe I haven't necessarily heard a great answer on this yet, and I've asked it a few times. But when we talk about how we measure success and good behavior, in terms of this group did something amazing, this we should try and measure that and work out how we can get others to kind of like do that. How every single time I hear about measuring, people are almost saying success is when our number of violations go down, and it's almost like the reverse. We're looking at how bad we were and how bad we are now, and the difference is getting slightly better. But how can we measure things that are actually good things, like, oh, this developer, they fixed a vulnerability before, at the right time, very, very far left, and as a result it didn't get into CI, or didn't get into. How do we measure good security behavior?
I think it's an interesting question. I think just picking up on that last one might be quite difficult. I'm not sure how many developers would like you to be getting real-time stats about their activity in their IDEs, but I think it's context is key for all of this, and I think a really important thing is I think accuracy of the metrics we're getting as well. And I think it comes down a lot to actually the maturity of your implementation of DevOps practices. So if you're doing continuous monitoring, well, if you apply the cultural principles, so you've got a shared responsibility and you're freely sharing information. So making sure you've got good coverage, and this is where kind of cloud native can help here, because if you've got a CSPM tool which is continually scanning all of the resources deployed in your environment, you can be fairly confident you've got some good coverage there. Because we have seen in the past where sometimes it's not in business or product owners' best interest to be highlighting all of their risks on their platform. So you need to, you'd like to be able to say you can trust everything, but really you need the hard data points and the confidence and coverage to guarantee that. So ensuring accuracy of your metrics probably is where we started, which is getting real data from good implementation of continuous monitoring. So that's partially answered some of it. I mean, in terms of measuring what's good as well, what we found is that when you actually have high performing teams, they're very easily able to implement all of the security requirements that come in. So, for a couple of projects, we did the threat modeling, identified all the security risks, all the required countermeasures. Because they're not chasing against the massive tech debt backlog, and they're good sprint planning, they're able to bring any missing issues in and quickly implement them. And because they're doing automated testing well, we can quickly validate that works and push them out through to production. So I think really good is all security requirements identified through threat modeling implemented, and that's backed up with your security testing tools in the pipelines, in their environments, corroborating that and saying, yep, we can't detect anything. And then you go to bug bounty programs, pen tests, are they also coming back with the same findings, which we can't find anything? So from my point of view, that's what good looks like when all of your metrics for different things come back with the same consistent results.
I mean, I think the other important thing here, Simon, honestly, is remember, we're talking DevSecOps. And here's, this is something that always kind of strikes me funny. We want to measure security, so we break out security and we measure just security. Well, why? It's DevSecOps. All this is together, and this is one of the key things when we talk about this model is bringing those various metrics of your entire pipeline and your entire paradigm together. So if I've got dev, I've got security, I've got operations, I want to be looking at what all of them are doing and how, again, as we're building these relationships, we talked about a really simple one before, right? The number of commits, which a lot of dev teams will watch that. That's a metric that a lot of dev teams follow. Couple that with a security metric of number of vulnerabilities in that code. And so if you want to find, okay, who are my high performing developers? Well, they're the ones where that relationship between those two numbers is you want that low ratio of, high number of commits to low number of vulnerabilities. And so it's a great way to pull that in. Now you can start to think about that, and you can do the same thing from the operations side. Well, let's look at what are some of the key metrics we're watching from the operations side. We're probably looking at things like idle time on some of our hosts. Are we properly tuned within EC2? Or are we, our containers deconstructing? Is Kubernetes configured the right way so that we're not expending extra dollars in cloud resources? Well, now let's tie that back to the number of real-time violations I'm seeing in my cloud monitoring tools. And so again, you can tie security and ops and dev metrics together, and now that's what starts to give you that real context of, are we actually, let's look for positive things. You're committing a bunch and you're not introducing a bunch of new vulnerabilities. I love that. That's great. And if you're worried about them gaming that system, you can do a number of lines of code changed or whatever. But there's different ways to do that and what makes sense for your org. But find those, whatever you're measuring now, and just how do they relate together, because that's what's going to tell you what you're doing from an overall pipeline perspective.
Sounds great. And I think we're coming up to time. So one of the things I'd just love to kind of really highlight as one of the most core things, which is really gone through all of our discussions, is all about context and making sure you don't just provide a number without understanding what is behind that number, and don't be pushing that number to anyone outside of your group, whereby they'll make assumptions based on that number without the real understanding of where that number came from. I'd love to ask you one final question each, which is the same question. If you were to give one piece of advice to someone who wants to create some kind of a measurement to understand where they're doing well in their security programs, what would it be? And while you're thinking about that, I'll quickly just share my screen again, just to show you the report on Snyk pages, which Alyssa wrote, and there's a whole ton of really good information here, which we've only covered a little bit of in the slides, but it goes into much more depth about how you can create or how you can think about creating that model. It doesn't provide you with a model, obviously, but it makes you think about how you can build up these graphs effectively to model your own environment. So do check that out on the Snyk.io site. So Alyssa, why don't we come to you first? What would your one gem be that you would advise people?
Start simple and plan for a program. Honestly, I mean, if you think about it in terms of, just what do we have now? What's already there? What can we leverage that's already there? It's simple. We have these numbers. Maybe they're meaningless to us now. Build those relationships and have a plan to keep introducing new metrics. If you think about the way you deployed your pipeline tools, you didn't just suddenly one day build this massively automated pipeline that did everything that you needed to and had complete CI/CD implementation. Nobody does that. You start simple. First, you get a repository in place, and you put your build tools, and you get those automated. Then maybe you add SaaS tools to that, and you automate that. It's the same thing with your metrics program. Expect it to be something you're going to continue to build and improve over time, but start simple with something that you can easily digest day one.
And perhaps even to extend that with a smaller subset of teams to start out with, and build that up with a small group of data first.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great point for adoption. Yeah.
No, it's a really good point. Thank you, Alyssa. And Nick.
I think the first one is every org company is going to be different, so I wouldn't worry about being too prescriptive. Find out what works for your teams, for your org structure, and for the tools you're using. But I think, I'm a big proponent of threat modeling. So I think you start at the design, because really, if you've got a consistent means of identifying what the security threats are across all of your products, you're just at a better place. That helps you identify what metrics you should be capturing for each product, and then you can go and figure out the best way to centralize it or give those metrics meaning. But having a consistent approach to identifying the risk is where I start.
Awesome, both great advice. And yeah, do check out, well, in fact, we should absolutely follow Alyssa and Nick on the Twitters and the internets as well. So what's the best places to follow you both?
I'm not on Twitter, but
you're not on Twitter. Wow, that must be a wonderful life you lead, Nick.
I'm on LinkedIn, but yeah, so that's probably best.
Yeah, I was gonna say Twitter is actually the best place to follow me. Probably the easiest to find me. Although you can also find me on LinkedIn. I'm just not as active there. But either one, please reach out, give me a follow, connection request, whatever. Always happy to chat more and share my ideas and hear what other people's ideas are too.
Awesome. Well, thank you. Big thanks for your time and knowledge, both Alyssa and Nick. Really appreciate it. Thank you everyone for your attendance and your time. This session has been recorded, and we will be sending this out to you. In the meantime, as I mentioned, feel free to go to Snyk.io and you can check out the report and the white paper there to learn more about measuring. Thank you everyone, and have a great day.